Dave Hobbins is our presenter tonight, and Dave is retired from the University of Maine at Fort Kent after 32 years of teaching. He taught mapping, forestry inventory, and insects and diseases of trees. He lives in Fort Kent with his wife, Janine, who is here with us tonight. And he really enjoys traveling. He likes to camp. He does a lot of hiking. He enjoys history. He likes backyard astronomy. You know, he's got a telescope up at his place. He does a lot with native bees. He's going to be, can I say, published?
Hopefully.
With a bee book. And he enjoys spending time on his woodlot. So Dave is a past board member and chairperson of the St. John Valley Senior College. And we miss him dearly, but we understand he's a busy, busy man. And so we appreciate all he's done for our organization, and would like you to join us in welcoming him tonight as he enlightens us about the life of a tree.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Hey, thank you for being here. I really appreciate this turnout. Thank you very much. I want to thank the board for letting me do this in 2 sessions, because it's just too much for one session, as I'm sure Laura could attest, the other resident forester in the room. And so anyway, and I do want to mention, if any of you are interested in some of the bee stuff, because we had a big snowstorm last year during the bee talk, if you go to YouTube and you Google bumblebees in my backyard, you'll come across my 3-part talk on bumblebees and some other stuff. So, and hopefully by the end of the week I'll be posting the biology of the brown belted bumblebee, which is one of the most widely spread bumblebees, except in northern Maine. I'll be talking about that bee. I've been trying to do literature review before I post anything. So anyway, thank you. With that, I'll go into tree biology. You can see my wife here next to a redwood tree. I have some samples. In fact, there are giant sequoia seed, giant sequoia cone, redwood cone in the back if you've never seen them before, because it's amazing. And I do have an illustration here that shows you seed, cone, and tree for giant sequoia in a little bit. So with that, I'll get started. So thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. So just to have the textbook definition, when we talk about a tree, you know, what makes a tree, what makes a shrub not a tree? Well, it's having one stem, at least 15 feet tall, a couple inches in diameter, not a bunch of multiple stems, even though we know trees can be damaged and you can have multiple stems. So anyway, that's the textbook definition. So trees fall under 2 groups of plants. One's called the gymnosperms, and gym for naked, sperm for seed, so gymnosperm. And there's a group in there called the coniferales, the conifers. And they're just trees that bear cones. So all of these, with a couple of exceptions, are woody trees that have resin. Right? That's where we get turpentine and things like that from that resin. And they can have needles. They can be like spruce, a single needle, or pine, like white pine with 5 needles in a cluster. Like cedar, they can be scale-like. But there are a few exceptions, and one is the ginkgo biloba, which you may have seen around. And ginkgo tree actually is in the fossil record in North America, but was discovered in, I think it was in China. It was in a monastery. And since it's been planted widely, and in fact, all over Maine, you'll see ginkgo. Pretty disease resistant, that's why people like it. But it has a broadleaf and it's deciduous, meaning it drops its leaves every fall. So you don't think of it as being a coniferale or a conifer. And then all of these have cones and seed with exception of yew, Y-E-W. Yews, like the western yew that's used for, what's the chemical?
Taxol.
I'm sorry?
Taxol.
Taxol, thank you. Which is used in cancer treatments, right? That yews have a seed that has a gelatinous, like it's almost like a berry. That's the only exception. Everything else is cone-like. So here you can see spruce seed, about 2 inches of white spruce with some seed up here. Here's some balsam fir seed. I would have been happy to bring in a balsam fir cone, but they fall apart. So pieces of it are in the back in a bag if you'd like to see that. So on the top of a fir tree, you'll see these little spikes, and that was where the cone was on the tree. And I have a photo of that later. The angiosperms, that's the other group. Oh, and excuse me, let me go back. There's 95 species in North America of conifers. There's a bunch of exotics. We've brought in all kinds of stuff. In fact, if you look down I-95, you're going to see Austrian and Scots pine, which they were kind enough to bring in needle disease, which has affected our white pine crops and other things. So we're really good at spreading things. Angiosperms, what's different about them is the seed is in some kind of a vessel, okay? And so there's 20,000 flowering plants in North America, but only 560 are really trees. And some of these, like you can see here, this is a chestnut. This is the male flower of the chestnut. That's in my yard. We had a minus 40 one year and the top 12 feet died back, but it's really recovered well. And this is a burl, which would have maybe 3 nuts in it, and there's 2 samples of that in the back. And if you look at one of them, you'll see some chestnuts. They're not fertilized. They weren't pollinated, so they're not fertile. They're dried up, but you can at least see what it might look like. Very good eating, especially roasted. And so anyway, the angiosperms are flowering, and some of them, like I said, we think of the cherries, you think of apples. Apples are not native to North America. There's a crab apple that is. But they have really showy flowers. And then other things like birch isn't very showy. Okay? But we'll be looking at those in more detail. But like I said, there's about 560 species in North America. And I'll tell you right now, there's also 2 groups of flowering plants. If you think about corn and palm and palmetto, those are what they call monocots. Mono because they have a seed leaf that it stores all the energy, but there's only 1 leaf. And I'm not going to talk about them because those are the palm trees, which I know very little about, and they're fibrous, not woody like I'm used to. So I'm going to concentrate on the dicots, which have 2 seed leaves, and you'll see an illustration of this a little later on. And I'm going to be really focused on the temperate trees, right? So where we have climate, where we have a change of seasons. And as I said, although apple isn't native, I had to throw that in there. You can have seed covered in a vessel which would be a single seed, right, like an acorn, an oak, or you can have a bunch of seed in the fruit, like an apple, and then wing fruits and mountain ash, which is more like an apple in terms of it's meatier than, say, a cherry, which is a berry. So I'm going to split this into 2 sessions. Again, thank you, Senior College, for letting me do that, because there's just too much information. So we'll talk about photosynthesis through growth. And then the second half, we're going to look at where and why trees grow where they do, and look at a few select species. So if you have any burning question about a particular tree, let me know. And there's not going to be a lot of room, but hopefully I've covered it. Or if there's enough interest, I'll throw in a couple other that you might be interested. I'm going to do all the big and old trees, and I'll do a number of the major native trees in Maine. But if there's something burning for you, let me know. All right, so I kept this simple in terms of photosynthesis. Some of you may remember when Mr. Roy gave the talk on solar panels. And same thing. It's light energy that excites a molecule, excuse me, and that molecule is chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is an organic compound that is really just a pigment. And it's a magnesium atom surrounded by a couple of nitrogen and then some carbon-hydrogen molecules. And it has the ability to get excited by solar radiation and can combine CO2, carbon dioxide, and water to create glucose or sugar. And then it also gives off oxygen, and technically it gives off water as well. So this is the same kind of a process. It's not the same chemistry, but it's very similar to what Mr. Roy talked about when he did the solar panel talk. So CO2 and water with solar and with chlorophyll is going to give us sugar. Okay? And that sugar is going to be the building block for everything else that the tree can make, all the tissues, proteins, etc., etc. Okay? But I need to have chlorophyll, I need to have sunlight. I also need to have nutrients and water, right? But the opposite of that, which we do and which plants also do all the time, is respiration. So I'm going to take the sugar with oxygen and I'm going to break that down as an energy source and also as a building block for my protein. Obviously I'm doing pretty good. My proteins, my meaty tissue. So the thing to keep in mind is respiration is happening all the time. So think about this. In a tree, I lose my leaves, let's be generous, say, except for my oak, we won't count the oaks. In October, my leaves are gone maybe. November, December, January, February, March, April, May. That's how long they are working to just kind of stay alive, low respiration rate, all through the winter, right? That's a lot of demand in that short time then. May, June, July, August, September, I have 5 months to kind of create enough sugar to be able to survive any onslaught of insects, disease, and a long winter. Okay, not also every night. So every night I'm not producing sugar, I'm going to be using the sugar, right, if I'm a tree. And again, as Dave Hobbins sleeping he also is using sugar. So think of the crown of the tree as a sugar factory. And for those of you that might be pruning your trees, you want to be thinking about leaving as much of that crown as possible. Never take, in terms of the mass of foliage, don't take off more than a third. 30% would be safe bet. You need to leave as much sugar factory as possible for that tree to create energy. Now, how do they do it in sugaring maple syrup? They thin every tree around it as best they can so that crown gets big, big, big. And so they're producing extra, hopefully, right? Because you're draining a lot of energy from a tree by taking syrup. So you got to compensate. So what we'll do now is we'll look at regeneration or reproduction, if you want to use that term. There's 3 methods that are vegetative. In other words, the tree produces a bud or roots and it grows. And then we have sexual reproduction. Yes, ma'am?
Just a quick question. You're talking about respiration. Where does that occur when there are no leaves on the tree?
Any cell. Any cell in the stem, in the branches, in the roots. But remember, in the wintertime, there's been a lot of change in the fall, which we'll talk about. And so the respiration rate is going to be down because it's colder. So that's going to help. But it's every cell in the tree that's alive.
Okay.
Will have to respire somewhat.
Okay.
Yeah. But again, it's going to be, in the wintertime, it'll be definitely a reduced rate. Won't be anything like during the growing season. Okay, so there's 3 forms of vegetative reproduction. And this may be a little hard to see, but if you look along here, what you don't see is a root. So this is a cut that I had done in 2017, right before Christmas. This is a couple years later. These are aspen root suckers. And aspen has this unbelievable ability to regenerate. Seed, stumps, and root suckers. It can reproduce like nobody's business. So what you're seeing here is when the soil gets warm, aspen will create buds on the root and up come stems. That's how they populate empty fields, right? Pasture and such. And that's what you're seeing right here. Not this stump. This is a conifer stump that's not aspen. On the other side, this is from a chestnut plot that I had when I was doing my master's. And I don't know how well you can see this, but we have the original stems here that died from disease, was cut. Then there were some stump sprouts that came up. You can see 4 here for sure. And then those were cut because they may have died. And then these are the next set of stump sprouts. American chestnut, one of the reasons it was able to survive was because of this ability to sprout. There are also trees that, mature trees that are outside Washington State, Michigan, that are outside the range of where the disease was spread. So anyway, root suckers and stump sprouts, and a lot of our trees, except when they're really, really young, and when they're really, really old, don't have the ability to sprout. Most of them do. The hardwood trees, broadleaf trees, flowering trees, can do that a lot better than conifers. The next method is called fragmentation. I guess the best example of this is cottonwood. So if you break off a branch, it floats down the river, sticks in the mud, there's a chance it could grow roots and become the cottonwood tree. And that's exactly what happened there. Okay? Now I just showed this to show you a muddy bank. There's really no tree here. This is mostly shrubbery. But just to give you an idea. And fragmentation, if you think about this, this is the #1 method of every greenhouse and horticulturalist, right? They may use cut and root hormone, but this fragmentation is what they're doing. So it's really common practice by us. And then the third method is layering. It's not that common, but it happens, especially around here. We'll see it on black spruce, cedar. This is a linden in my yard. And if you look at this bottom branch, it's gotten into the soil and took root because of the weight of the branch, pushed it down. And these are all the stems coming up from that one branch. So that's layering. So it does happen. I wouldn't count on it for regenerating a field, but it does happen. Okay, so we go from vegetative reproduction, and keep in mind that if you say vegetative reproduction, every individual stump sprout, root sucker, branch that comes up out of the soil is identical, genetically identical to the parent. Right? There's no variation. They are identical. They're equally susceptible to whatever disease or problem there might be. Sexual reproduction is where we're sharing genetic material between the male and the female. And with maples, we'll talk about it, it becomes very interesting. But here you're seeing, in fact, Don, you may recognize the back of the gymnasium. I had transplanted a jack pine back there because I needed specimens. I think it's long gone, but what you're seeing here is on the conifers, a pollen sac. Think of it as a cone, but it's a little less woody, so it breaks down. It'll last for a few weeks and then will disappear. So this is the male pollen cone or pollen sac. This is the female cone, the seed cone. Now in all pines, it takes 2 years from the time pollen is released, usually in the spring. It'll get into, and I had a really good picture and I could not find it, of a small red receptive cone, because that's what they get, almost red to purple color. You see that, they're waiting for pollen. Okay? And so a lot of times what's going to happen is the female cones, and this varies, but in general the female cones will be higher on the tree. And that gives them the chance to get pollen from another tree, not their own tree. And if you grow blueberries or other plants in your yard, you may know they always say get another variety so you have better seed production or fruit production. So with the pines, it takes 2 years from pollination till the seed fall. All the others, fir, spruce, hemlock, cedar, all it's 1 year. Okay, and in the back there's some, you'll see some cedar seed, some cedar cones. Help yourself to check that out. So again, this is all the conifers will do this kind of process for sexual reproduction. Then we get into, oh yeah, and as I mentioned, I was out skiing and I brought my camera. If you see that upper arrow, sorry, I can't reach. I have a height disability. If you look at that upper arrow, you'll see some stems there pointing straight up. Those are the middle part of the seed cone for fir. They fall apart. And the true cedars, the cedrus like you see out in California, they have the same thing. The cone doesn't stay intact, it falls apart. So if you'd like to see one of those, I have what's left of one in the bag in the back. You can check that out. But for the cone bracts, they're called a bract, they're wooden, and they'll just fall off and then the seed disperses via wind, usually all winter long. And then this is a little hard to see also because of the backlight, but you can see some brown where the arrow is. You can see that all those cones tend to be towards the top, right? Outer portions. That's where the seed is going to have better dispersal. The pollen cones, this is just a generalization because it can vary quite a bit. Pollen cones will tend to be mid-crown. And that way they're going to get caught by air currents and hopefully pollinate another tree, not the same parent tree, right? And you're going to have better success with seed production. All right, now we get into the flowering trees. And a lot of our trees flower every year and produce seed every year. Like maples can produce seed every year. But maybe every other year, like red maple, might have a good crop of seed. Whereas with a lot of the conifers, it can be 3 to 5 years for seed. So on the left here, we're looking at a linden tree. And I apologize because I took this picture a little late. This is what it should look like. That these are the anthers with the pollen. And I put an arrow up at the top with the pollen's kind of dispersed off of those anthers at the top. And then this is the female part. So these are the male parts of the flower. This is the female, the pistil. And the pollen, hopefully from another tree, is going to land on that. But these trees have a lot of nectar. Linden trees are called honey trees by beekeepers because any insect that you want to find that likes nectar will be on a linden tree for our 1.5 to 2 weeks in the middle of the summer. But this is what a botanist would call a perfect flower because it has both the male and the female parts in one flower. Okay? And what's going to happen is the pollen is going to land on the top of that pistil and it's going to germinate and go down and pollinate the ovary that's down in this base part of the pistil. Okay? And then the seed is going to develop here. And I have a couple of samples of what that fruit looks like in the back. It's just a tiny little hard seed coat there's a wing on it, and they do disperse by wind. But these are heavily pollinated by insects. So you have a lot of them, a lot of the fruit, wherever there's nectar produced, you're going to have insect pollinating, right? Sometimes even other animals. Then we have the maples. Red maple tends to have the lightest of the seed. Silver maple, out here in front of the library, there's 2 nice silver maple, have the heaviest seed. They both flower really early in the spring before the leaves are even out. With silver maple, it's as early as you can get. And they're going to have their seed mature in a number of weeks, probably before the leaves are fully out. Okay? Sugar maple, on the other hand, takes 16 weeks for the seed to mature. So that's not going to disperse seed until later in the season. But more importantly is, you're seeing red maple here. Some of you may have heard me say this, but if you look like in northern Maine at an aerial image, especially even a satellite image, of Aroostook County in May, you're going to see the flowers from red maple. They're that brilliant, even from a satellite view. And these are the male anthers with pollen. And maples are a little crazy. A lot of times, it'll be one branch will be male, one branch will be female. The tree will be male or female. There's at least 4 or 5 different versions of that. In fact, silver maple, again, like the ones out in front of the library and that we have on the river here, over on that McDonald's trail, there's silver maple there with, what's that prickly understory that picks you when you walk through it? No, the smaller. I'm sorry, it'll come to me. Stinging nettle. There's stinging nettle, a big flat. There's stinging nettle and the silver maple are in there. Silver maple will have branches that are clustered, female and then male, and female and male on the same branch. Female trees, male trees, and then there are trees that have some female parts, but mostly male. And then silver maple also, there are a few, very few, that have a perfect flower. So it's really crazy, and how that develops, I have no idea. But anyway, they're really interesting. And of course, you see the cherries on the left, and choke cherry. And then the maple has, this fruit is actually called a samara, but wing fruit, helicopter works for me. And so the maples will have these paired winged fruit, but ash and elms and birch also have a winged fruit, although the wing isn't as dramatic as that. And there's some birch seed in the back. I don't know if any of the rest of you, but last summer, my driveway was coated with birch seed. I mean, I was shoveling birch seed. That's how much birch seed I had from just a couple of trees, one on either side of my driveway. So that's where that's from. And then, of course, we have the oak, which is the acorn. But there's a lot of other fruits, right? The nuts and the apple, the pomes. So a lot of stuff. I wanted to show you this. So this is when Janine and I went out to California. That's the General Sherman tree. That's the biggest in terms of mass of any tree on the planet. This is a cone. You can see it's almost 2 inches in size. This is giant sequoia cone, and that's the seed. Seed is tiny. That tiny seed will develop into this tree. It's just amazing to me, and live for several thousand years. So the point here was to make the point that sexual reproduction, right, you're going to have genetic variation, which is really important as things change. The tree will have that the offspring in general will have that variation that it can adapt, hopefully, to any changes that might happen in the environment over time. So it's really going to be, the unique offspring of the 2 different parents. And how does it disseminate? Well, wind, water, and animals. And animals are really important, especially where you have fruit. There's a lot of seed. These thick seed coats have to be etched somehow. And a lot of times, if they're going through the gut of a bird, when they come out, that seed coat has been etched. And so it can absorb water a little more easily. Maples, you don't have to do anything to a maple. It'll germinate. In fact, silver maple, if it's buried, will actually germinate under the soil. Well, you won't see it until the new shoot actually comes up. You won't see the immature stuff, or the what's the word I want? The seed leaves. You won't see that. So through the kindness of this Island Light Photography, they let me use this photograph, and it's a little out of reach, so let me use this. If you look here, you can see 2 seed leaves, 2 cotyledons. And those of you that garden and have seen this in beans and a bunch of other plants, here's the wing and the seed coat being shed. It's obviously driven its root in first, but there are those cotyledons. Here's an oak. This is down near Farmington, and you can see it drove in a root, and then here's the new shoot coming up, and the seed leaves are, it's a little hard to see, are here, right inside. So the seed leaves are doing all the, supplying all the energy until I get real leaves that can photosynthesize, right? And notice there's chlorophyll even in the stem of the maple, and you'll see that with a lot. And you can see the chlorophyll already developing in the young leaves of the oak. And then if all goes well and the seed is landed in the right spot and it has adequate moisture and it can get down through the organic layer, because that can dry out really easily. And if your roots aren't past that, you're done, right? So get into the mineral soil and start growing and get established, and then we can take off from there. Any questions? Okay, so we'll talk about tree growth, and I want you to just keep it simple. Primary growth is anything that's a tip of the root, tip of the branch, main stem, that's primary growth. Secondary growth is wood. So wherever wood is produced, roots, stem, twigs, branches, that's secondary growth. And there's an order to the sugar allocation, so that's important. So one of the things about transplanting is you can yank. I did a transplant study for myself years ago. I took tiny seedlings to almost 6 foot tall fir and transplanted them into an area. And it was remarkable how many of those big trees actually survived, even though I practically just dug them up with a shovel and moved them. But what happens is when you pull a tree or a plant out of the soil, these root hairs are very vulnerable. And so the root hairs on the fine root, okay, that's primary growth for the root. And they are doing all the work of water and nutrient absorption, right? This is where all the hard work is done in bringing moisture and nutrients into the tree, okay? So it's pretty important to protect that. So if you're transplanting, you want to get as much of that fine root as you can. If you do have to dig, I always sharpen a shovel when I am cutting larger roots, because if you get a clean cut on a root, you'll get 2 root initials. If it's jagged or whatever, it's a problem. So I actually take a file and file down one side of my shovel so I get a sharp edge on it. So the root hairs, the fine roots, are doing all the work, and that is where the primary root growth happens. And so what drives that is soil moisture and temperature. So I did a little bit of a literature review for this, and one of the things I found, a 2007 study in Europe, where they found that if you have at least 43 degrees, and you'll get some root growth in trees. Optimum is in the 60s. So about 61 degrees, you're going to get your best root growth. And they didn't do a maximum. So at least in the 40s if you want any kind of root growth. Now obviously, the soil's got to be thawed, and you have to have moisture in addition to the temperature. Then we look at the stem, and when we're looking at the stem, there's a little terminology here, but it's not that big of a deal. The height growth is going to come from the leader, right? The top branch. And on conifers, all trees will grow up, but the conifers, no matter if they're shaded or not, will tend to grow straight up, straight off of the ground, perpendicular to the ground. Whereas the broadleaf trees or the flowering trees, a lot of them will actually grow up and then out towards sunlight. So that's something to keep in mind. And this growth on the apice, or the end of a branch, that bud is called the apical bud, and that is going to be where that dominance is going to be coming from. There's hormones in there that control that vertical growth. So when we're looking at stem growth or buds above ground, we're looking at air temperature, moisture, and in some cases sunlight. There's a lot of trees that have to have some sunlight to kind of initiate growth, but really the focus to me should be air temperature and moisture. So I want to talk about something that's not a lot in the literature, and that is fixed growth and free growth. So here you're seeing on my woodlot this balsam fir, and you can see it's a young balsam fir. And here's the apical bud covered in wax. It's a little hard to see. And then there's some lateral buds around it. Just means that they're lateral to the top. And so what's going to happen is, as temperature warms up and I have adequate moisture, that bud is going to grow and form into a new apical stem, a new terminal. So if you look over here on the right, you can see there's a whorl of branches right here. This is what they call a node. All of these side branches, these lateral branches, and this terminal leader were all grown last year. And fixed growth means that these buds here that you see on the left, every initial of every leaf that's going to be produced that year is already primordially in there. I'm not saying that very well, but hopefully that comes across. So the only thing that's happening is I'm producing tissue around that, but I'm not going to get any new buds, right? What I'm trying to say is it's already predetermined. What's determining the height growth is how much moisture I have in the spring. So if I have a really dry spring, that's going to be shorter. Okay, of course, competition matters too, but a lot of that has to do with moisture. Now, free growth, most of our trees up here have a fixed growth, but there's a few like aspen that will continue to grow throughout the season and produce new buds as it's growing throughout the season, and then eventually frost will cause it to stop. So aspen is incredible. Quaking aspen or balsam poplar, the same. Really incredible. Seed production, stump sprouts, root suckers, it can produce really well. But it has a little bit more of a free growth than you'll see in our other trees and the conifers. Most of our northern temperate trees tend to be fixed growth. So again, here's a lateral branch. You can see a spruce here with terminal bud and lateral buds, apical bud. And then here's the jack pine, and you can see that candle. That's the bud has grown as an extending. They call it like a candle. And then so the stem is extending, the stem is expanding, and then the needles will expand off of that stem. All right, so now wood growth. So obviously the purpose of root growth is to be absorbing moisture and nutrients, to get out there, to reach out and down to get those water and nutrients. When it comes to the stem, and we have secondary growth, remember secondary growth is wood. It's wood growth. And what that gives us is a couple of things. One is the sapwood is conducting water. We're going to look at the inner bark, which is a little hard to see right here, but the inner bark is what they call the phloem. That's going to be conducting sugars. And this wood is going to supply structure to the tree to hold up that crown. The roots, the same thing. The secondary growth of roots, it's going to give us structure to withstand wind, right? The timing of this, I failed to say that in primary growth. The timing of primary growth is going to be in the spring. And that primary growth, except for those that are free growing, is pretty much done by midsummer most of the time, right? Secondary growth will definitely go into midsummer and can continue. So as long as I have pretty good conditions, and we'll look closely at a ring of growth here in a little bit. And again, what's driving this is moisture availability and temperature and available sugar. right? I have to have sugar, moisture for this to happen. There's been a lot of studies over history in forestry that have looked at sapwood, and there's an absolute direct correlation with the surface area of sapwood, this is what's conducting water, and the surface area of your foliage. Absolute direct correlation. So the tree would be making a mistake if it kept all this wood alive and would have to feed that all the time. So what it does is, I'm going to have enough sapwood to supply my crown, and then I'm going to let those cells and those vessels die off, and they'll just provide structure. Okay? So if I kept that all alive, I'm going to have to feed that all the time, and that's going to be a big drain if I have a rough year. So how do I get around that? I let that tissue die off. I don't need it. Now, don't get too hung up on this technical terminology, but if you look at the outer bark, that's obviously for protection. The inner bark is called the phloem. The phloem, or the inner bark, conducts sugar throughout the tree. So this is vascular tissue, right? Just like our veins and arteries. The sapwood is vascular tissue, so there's long tubes, same here. There are long tubes that interconnect, and this conducts water. So sugar conduction, water conduction, structure of the heartwood, the dead cells, dead vessels. The vascular cambium is the tissue, and it's only a couple cells wide. You don't see this with the naked eye. Sometimes you can pick up a little pink, but usually it's the phloem. The vascular cambium will divide to the outside and become bark or phloem, and will divide to the inside to become wood. It may only be a couple of cells wide. Is that clear to everybody? Now I misspoke, and I said it divides outside to become bark. That's not true. It becomes phloem. Bark has its own cambial layer, and I wanted to avoid that discussion. Yes, sir?
When they do maple sugaring and they tap trees, what part of the tree are they tapping? Or where
This is what they need to tap, but a lot of times they go through it and they're tapping both areas.
You'll get sugar from both?
No, you're getting sugar from here, but you're getting all that extra water from here.
So ideally you would just tap that out?
Well, I don't know for sure, but I suspect that if you only tap this, there might not be a lot of flow. This may be forcing because water's being pumped up during the, is it night or the day? I think during the day it's being pumped up, cool night. So I think you would need this to extract that, but I'm talking way beyond what I know, so I apologize.
Thank you.
Yeah. And like I said, roots, the secondary growth of roots, those of you that have lived in town where you have a sidewalk and the sidewalk gets pushed up by the root, but that's providing structure. And it's the same cross-section as the stem, right? The root, if you were to cut a root, well, the bark might look a little different, but the wood inside is going to look the same, right? Vascular cambium, phloem, and xylem. But we have oaks and we have some pine that can have a taproot that is obviously some evolutionary advantage to go down to get water, and then also you have the lateral roots. So in addition to the fine roots, you have feeder roots that are feeding the big structural roots. And there are people that have studied, root systems and whatever. So if you're interested, let me know. I'll dig around and find out who's doing those studies. So this is really interesting, and that is the tree has the ability to, as I mentioned, if I have limited sugar, I want to keep my cells alive, number one. And the tree can do that. If I had a really rough year, insects defoliated me, or windstorm took out half of my crown, I'm going to have a limited sugar, probably reserve. So what I can do is just keep my cells alive, and if I have enough sugar, then I can do primary growth. But the first thing sacrificed is wood growth, secondary growth. First thing sacrificed. And that's why we can read tree rings to talk about bad years and actually cross-date different trees. So secondary growth will be the first thing lost if I'm short on sugar. So here's a little fir tree. I forget, I think it was like 32 years. I should have counted it again. What I want to show you here, you can obviously see wood, but this little area right here is the phloem, and the bark is just outside of that. So if you look right here, this is the phloem. The cambium is really microscopic. It's going to be hard to see. And then that's the bark. We look, oh, and then also notice here, see how narrow this ring is? So something was going on that caused a little bit of reduction in growth that particular year. So it was doing really well and then started to slow down and really slowed down and then started to pick up again. And if you think about this, okay, there's a lot of growth in this outer ring, and this outer ring is pretty good size. If you compare that outer ring to maybe this one is comparable, think about the surface area. That outer ring is putting on the same amount of growth around a bigger tree. So it's actually a lot more wood. And if you look at some cross sections of trees, you're going to see the rings get bigger and bigger and bigger as the crown and the foliage gets more and more, right? It's remarkable. It's logarithmic growth. It's unbelievable how that growth can occur. This is the pith in here. This is the center of the tree. This would be the first year. And if you look inside here, we have what foresters like to call springwood or early wood. That's the lighter wood. So where the line is, that's the end of the previous year. So you have the lighter wood here, springwood or early wood. And then as we get later in the season, the cells get thicker and smaller. Smaller in diameter and thicker. And so they actually are denser looking, right? It's darker because of the density of the rings. And that's the end of the year right there. So this is 1 year of growth throughout the spring and summer, and it stopped about here. Okay? So winter dormancy, I thought I'd talk about winter dormancy and fall color, because I figured you might be interested in that. And winter dormancy is one of the most interesting things that I learned studying trees. Foresters talk, or scientists talk about moderate moisture stress. And keep in mind, I studied out west where there's not a lot of rain in the summer. So there's a lot of moderate moisture stress in the northern Rockies. And at any rate, that's one of the things that might initiate the tree to start thinking about going in dormancy. The other thing is photoperiod. Photoperiod is how long is your day, how long is your night. Photoperiodism is how the plant responds to the length of day and night. And this is really a remarkable thing. I'm easily entertained, I know, but I really find this really interesting. And then temperature, obviously, is involved. So this phytochrome system, so midsummer, low moisture, moderate moisture stress, but this phytochrome system is a protein that has an active and inactive form. Okay? But if this protein is exposed to red light, it changes form to an active form. This is an unbelievable discovery. And so what happens is, we just had not too long ago spring equinox. And so the days are getting longer, oh, thank goodness, right? The days are getting longer and longer, closer to gardening. And at some point, we're going to have much longer days, and so I'm going to have a lot of active form in the leaves. Okay? And as night happens, then this active form will regress to the inactive form. But hopefully there's enough of it that I'm keeping enough active form to tell the plant all is well. Then summer solstice, and my days start getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And clearly by August, things have kicked in, so I have less and less active form because the nights are longer. And for some reason, and I don't know that they completely understand this, this inactive form, when it reaches a certain concentration, the plant knows it needs to start doing dormancy. And so around here, for example, when we get into August, that's when you start seeing the fir buds are formed, and then they start to get waxy. And that tree is kind of hardened off, almost ready for winter. And this has a lot to do with that. It's really cool. Okay, so anyway, I thought you might be interested in fall color. So the Forest Service, if you were to Google this, look for the Forest Service article on this. It's really well done. So photoperiodism that we just talked about, length of day and night, has a lot to do with it, right? Obviously the dormancy. And then there's pigments involved, which we'll talk about, 3 different pigments, one being chlorophyll. And then the weather. And that's not just the fall, but also spring and summer. So let's get into that. And I kind of did this a little backwards. But anyway, there are 3 pigments. Chlorophyll, which we talked about, is constantly being formed and then degraded. New chlorophyll, and of course it gets old and degrades. New chlorophyll. Eventually what's happening is that with the short days and the initiation of dormancy, less and less chlorophyll may be being formed. So chlorophyll and the carotenoids are in an organelle in the cell of every cell of the leaf. That's where photosynthesis is happening. So chlorophyll is dominant, and so when it's there, it may be absorbing red, but it is reflecting green. Right? That's what we see. It's not using the green, it's reflecting it. The carotenoids, think of daffodils, the yellow of daffodils, the kind of orange of carrots, okay? The yellow of carrots, sorry, different carrot. And some of the orange colors are coming from carotenoids. And when chlorophyll starts to degrade, we start to see the reflection of those yellows and browns and oranges. Okay? That's from the carotenoids. Now, when dormancy is initiated, one of the things that broadleaf trees need to do is they're going to lose their leaves. So they're going to start absorbing material, getting ready for winter. And the veins, so you have the leaf and you have the petiole, and the petiole attaches to the stem. And so they're going to be blocking off the veins. Okay? And by blocking off the veins, then eventually the leaf can fall off the tree for that year. Okay, so I'll come to the anthocyanin in just a second. So number 1, we need to have a warm, moist spring in order to have our best fall color. So believe it or not, it starts that far back. And I need to have a summer without any drought. Okay, so warm, moist spring, good droughtless summer. I'm going to have the chance for a good fall color. Next, in the fall, I need to have a warm sunny day, cool night, but no freezing. Now what's happening is anthocyanin will be formed in solution, in the solution of the cell. And the reason it's forming is as those veins get blocked off for getting ready for winter and leaf drop, the sun is beating down. If the sun is beating down on the leaf on a warm day, anthocyanin is going to be formed. Well, think of anthocyanin as blueberries, cranberries, strawberry color is coming from the anthocyanin. So if I have anthocyanins being formed because the veins are being blocked off, sugar is starting to accumulate in the leaf because it can't get out, anthocyanin will be formed, and warm sunny day, cool nights is going to drive that. And you'll have our best fall colors, especially the red maple, right? So without that, we're not going to be as fully red. It's going to be leaning towards orange. All right, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And next time we'll go into why and where trees grow. I think you'll find that really interesting. hopefully. Or your money back. Thanks for coming back on a beautiful day. I really appreciate that. What I want to do in this second half, I meant to jump to the second half, excuse me, is get into why trees grow, where trees grow and why. So we'll do that. And just as we're getting into that, we're going to be talking about competition. We need to talk about a thing called shade tolerance. And so keep in mind, this is really a graduation, right? It's not just strict categories. It's just easier for foresters to think in simple category. So by definition, shade tolerance is how much can I tolerate shade if I'm a tree? Okay, can I tolerate it a lot like sugar maple or very, very little like pitch pine? If you haven't seen pitch pine, you go down to Kennebunk or down to Cape Cod, Long Island, South Jersey. Pitch pine grows on those really sandy sites, and it's pretty, I don't know if drought resistant is the right word, but it can really tolerate dry. So anyway, an intermediate in between those, white pine is a good example. And we're going to look at some slides of a number of these, and as you have questions, we can answer those. So some of our best examples of, is everybody able to see the slide okay? Okay. Of shade intolerant might be birch. So if you have birch, it's a fast growing tree, but it doesn't like a lot of shade. And shade will cause it to the foliage to decline, the branches to decline a little bit. This is a shot that I took in November. I was hiking in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. So you're looking at pitch pine here. And there's a lot of fire down there. The fire frequency is pretty high, and we'll talk more about that. But this particular species doesn't like shade either, pitch pine.
If for whatever reason they do get shade, do they die?
If they get shaded out, then those branches, that foliage that's shaded will slowly decline. Yes, absolutely. And it's an interesting thing, because if you've ever been spending some time in the trees and you're there at one spot as the sun's moving, you'll see little holes of sun moving through there, right? So sun can get through. And so trees like these intermediate trees, now here, this is a woman or man from Minnesota that put these photos up. If you need some photos that are copyright free, as long as you cite them, you can go to forestryimages.com, and there's all kinds of, mostly it was based on tree disease, fungi, insects, but there's a lot of images. And so this person is from Minnesota, and here you can see a red pine stand with white pine coming in its shade. Now red pine doesn't offer a lot of shade, but it does obviously some. And this is the state record tree in Minnesota for eastern white pine. So white pine can tolerate some shade, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Now shade tolerant, around here, and probably in the east, probably the most shade tolerant tree there is sugar maple, beech being a close second. And so here you can see a stand. This is down in Lee, Maine, fall winter shot of it used to be, I think it used to be a sugar bush that was let go. So there probably was some thinning in there. This is in Baxter Park. Jeff Dubas let me use this. He apologizes. He didn't have a high resolution image. But what I want you to see here is this regeneration. That's all sugar maple. And if you've been down in Wallagrass, where the Irving, near Blake Lake, or Irving has some land down there, and there's thickets of just sugar maple regen in the understory there. And this is, we'll talk about a little bit later, northern hardwood stand. But anyway, sugar maple regen in the understory. So something to keep in mind, because we're going to get into competition between trees here in a second, is respiration rate. We talked about respiration. We all do it. We don't have any choice. If we're not doing it, it's not a good thing. So same with trees, right? So they're respiring all the time, and the only time they're not is when they're non-existent. But photosynthesis is only happening when there's sunlight and chlorophyll. So how efficient am I at using my sugar, and what's my respiration rate? If I have a lower respiration rate, then perhaps I'm going to be a little more competitive. I'm going to be able to be more efficient at using my resources like sun, water, and sugar. So we'll talk about that. So anyway, getting into where do trees grow and why, what I want to do is we'll get in, and I apologize here, you can see you don't see anything in Canada or Mexico, and it's same with the soils sciences. We use different classification system than our neighbors, right? So you can't match up the specific classification of forests. That's the only reason that they're not in the image. If I were to do biosphere or something like that, I could match them up. So apologies to our neighbors. So when we're talking about where trees are growing and why, we have to keep in mind about precipitation. It's not just how much, but it's what form of precipitation and when does it occur, okay? So all those things matter. And then, of course, temperature and wind have a huge influence on evaporation and what's going to make it into the soil. That's important as well. In addition is going to be the soil properties. We'll talk about that. And terrain. We'll talk about terrain. And keep in mind, I'm not just talking about change in terrain. I'm also talking about elevation, the aspect, and the slope. We'll get into that. And then generally competition. You know, where trees are growing and why has to do with their efficiencies and their ability to compete. And then luck. Sometimes it just, you know, where does the seed land and has a squirrel eaten it? So one of the things that I find really interesting is when you look at that map, and we're going to look at it again, is if you look at the East Coast and the West Coast, they're dominated by different forest types. So why is that? So let's get into why that is so. So this is from, well, it's a national map product, but it's the U.S. Forest Service. And if you look here at the east, is that mouse visible to everyone? If you look here at the east, all these shades of green are broadleaf trees, angiosperm trees, okay? So thin, broad leaves, maple, aspen, whatever it might be. And if you think about precipitation here, you know, like in caribou, say 40 inches of precip a year, it's thought that maybe 30 inches of precipitation is going to be necessary to grow a tree. At least that. And this is just a general, like a target, okay? But what's happening in the east is not only do we have westerlies, but we also have cyclonic weather that's coming up from the Gulf, coming up from the South Atlantic. So the east has moisture all year round, right? All the time we'll get either snow or rain or sleet or whatever, and I'm not talking about tomorrow night or Thursday. So there's always moisture here, okay? Now if we go out west, we have the westerlies, and I know there's other stuff going on for those of you that may know a lot about those, and maybe you can tell me what they're called. In Arizona, they have that season where you're bringing moisture up like through Baja and into Arizona. But think about the westerlies, if you will, for a second, and keep in mind that we have the coast mountains, we have the Cascades up here, we have the Sierras down here, and the Northern Rockies. And so as these moist airs are coming off, as the moist air is coming off the Pacific Ocean, and it's hitting land, it's going to be forced up. And as air is forced up, it's going to cool down, and cooler air cannot hold as much moisture. Okay? So cooler air is going to contract, and moisture is going to fall out in the form of precipitation. So when we're looking at the Pacific Northwest, we have really a temperate rainforest. There's over 100 inches of precipitation, mostly in the form of water, up here in Washington and Oregon. And then you'll notice here in the rain shadow, you have areas where there aren't forests, and there's even deserts because of the rain shadow, right? So that air hits the hills, gets forced up, water drops out of it. As it comes down over the other side, the air is expanding as it warms up and it's drier. So the relative humidity actually is going down. Okay, the absolute humidity won't really matter so much as the relative humidity, correct? Did I make sense out of that? Hopefully. So now that air is continuing from the coast, and now it's hitting the Cascades up in Washington State and Oregon, and it's hitting the Sierras, and it's being forced up. We're talking 14,000 feet, Mount Whitney in California, the highest peak. So it's being forced up, and so it's going to drop more moisture. And so here you can see those forests. And then it drops down on the other side, and that's where we get into the prairies and even some desert areas. So I went to school out here in Moscow, Idaho, University of Idaho, and I was in the Palouse Prairie, 22 inches of precip. No trees except where people planted them or in waterways. And it would be 30 miles to the east to get up to Moscow Mountain and where the Rockies are. So what's happening is in the Rockies, that air is continuing from the west. I guess I should be doing it this way, sorry. There we go, now I'm there. So that air is coming up. I just hope I don't confuse myself. That air is coming up, and think about it. If you're out west, what are the first forest trees you see? Pinyon and juniper in drier environments, kind of semi-arid almost. Go up in elevation a little bit more air, water is squeezed out, and you get ponderosa pine. In the middle latitudes, they get the most moisture, and again, this is a generalization. In those middle elevations, they're getting Douglas fir, grand fir, white pine, western white pine, and then it continues up and over. And then as it pours out into Montana and the west, we have our shortgrass prairies, maybe as little as 8 or 9 inches of precip, until it finally works its way a little further east and we get into the tall grass, well, what used to be the tall grass prairies, mostly all city and farm now. And then we finally hit the eastern forest. So that's great, Dave, but why are conifers dominating the northern Rockies, for example? And the real answer to that is because they may be getting a lot of precip, but they have none in the summer. So I worked forest inventory for 3 years in Idaho. On average, we get rained on twice in the summer. We'd be in a tent, get rained on twice. It wasn't a big deal. In fact, it was great because you work in the woods and there were no insects unless you were near still water or dead water, except for ticks. So it's dry in the summer. Broadleaf trees can't handle that. Although there's aspen there. Aspen will grow. Colorado is very famous for its aspen. But the broadleaves would be really, really stressed out if they didn't have the amount of moisture throughout the summer that we have. That's why it's dominated, the Rocky Mountains are dominated by conifers. Yes, ma'am?
Why is the west coastal area dominated by conifers?
That's a good question. There are a number of broadleaves. They have an alder, they have a maple out there. And I don't know that I can fully answer that question, but the other part of that is a lot of the trees on the coast are very large growing trees that also, there's a lot of coastal fog, so there's moisture. So it's a good question.
Yeah, there's always moisture.
Yes, yeah, it's a good question, but there's a lot of undergrowth, so I don't have a full answer for that, honestly. That's a good question. Were you a plant?
What?
Were you a plant? To trick me up. I'm joking. I'm joking.
I lived in Washington.
Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
And those are some dominant trees, and we'll look at a few of them.
Oh, yeah, they are.
So anyway, it's really interesting, especially in the Rockies, just really dry in the summertime. All right. So think about site. When we're looking at site, really need to first focus on soil. So soil is going to be pretty much predicting everything else that's going to happen or grow on that site. So I used to like to say that soils beget the vegetation and vegetation begets the wildlife or the animals, okay? And so we look at soil texture, and we'll talk about that. We look at soil chemistry, not just the pH, but also, what nutrients are available. And then drainage is also really important when it comes to soil. And that relates directly to texture. So soil texture is about the combination of 3 particle sizes. And those 3 particle sizes are sand, which are the largest particles. It has nothing to do with the mineral. It can be from different types of rock, but sand being the largest particles, clay being the tiny microscopic size particles, and then silt being in between. So sand, silt, and clay. And if you have a good mix of sand, silt, and clay, you're going to have a loam soil. Okay, that's going to give us a loam. Sandy side of things, it's dominated by sand. Clay side of things, it's dominated by clay. And as you know, sand drains like crazy. Clay holds water like crazy. So, and it's hard for roots to penetrate sometimes. But loam obviously is, that just right. So those types of soils, sand, loam, and clay, not the particle sizes, but the soil type, will predict how much moisture is going to be available to the tree and also the nutrient availability, right? So if I'm growing carrots, sand's not a problem, right? Because it drains really well and I just need to irrigate or do whatever. But if I'm growing a tree, broadleaf trees are going to have, except for some of the oaks, broadleaf trees are going to have some hard times growing in a sandy site. So those trees that can outcompete everybody else on a sandy site are going to dominate, right? And those that need a little bit more nutrition and better moisture availability, they're going to be the ones that are going to fall out. So here we have a loamy soil down in Lee, Maine, and broadleaf northern hardwood forest there. And on the sandy soil, this is out in Georgia, near Tifton, Georgia. This is a longleaf pine stand, which are very few of those because longleaf pine, which was native, fire tolerant and everything, but it was in the South, they heavily planted the faster growing trees. Like we did up here, we don't plant red spruce. We do now a little bit, but it's been mostly white spruce and black spruce. And red spruce doesn't grow as fast, so it's not as preferred, I guess, through time. Well, it's the same in the South, that sand pine, loblolly pine, much faster growing, so that's what was planted a lot. So longleaf pine's coming back, but those pines, loblolly pine, sand pine, longleaf pine that you see here can grow on those drier sites. They can tolerate that. Yes, sir?
I'm assuming they were planted a lot because of their economic value?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, all through the South, absolutely. That's the same. So a lot of that coastal plain is very sandy and so lends itself. And if you go to North Florida and you come across 10, you'll see plantation after plantation after plantation. And so when they harvest those, it's a clear cut, and then they pull the stumps and they extract turpentine from those. So it's a big operation, and then they put all that debris in piles and then they burn it. At least they used to. I don't know what the legal stuff is now.
Would what the end use of the tree be influence what they plant? Because I know different trees.
Absolutely.
The tree is not, they're not all equal.
Yeah,
Like
that's very true.
paper mill,
Yeah.
and they have different size fibers and
Yeah.
different characteristics. So you can use some of them for things like lumber and.
Well, ideally, you should be planting on the site what grows best on that site, ideally. But of course, markets are obviously going to dictate that. But yeah, you're absolutely correct. And when we were down here in Tifton, Georgia, near Tifton, Georgia, there was a lot of telephone pole manufacturing. A lot of pole manufacturing, not just telephone poles, but also piles for docks.
So in other words, the markets may have grown on what was available.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Ideally, we should be planting what the site would grow best, right? And then hopefully we have a market for that. Okay, so now terrain. So not just elevation, but aspect and slope. So elevation, pretty obvious. But aspect is which way am I facing? If I have a slope, which way do I face? South, west, north, or something else? And then slope, think of it as a percentage. So 100% slope would be, be 45 degrees. And what happens is, depending on your elevation, right? Depending on your aspect and the slope, that's going to influence the drainage, wind and sun exposure will be influencing the growth on that site. Those environmental factors. So anyway, I want to show you this. This is just north of Salmon, Idaho. So the Montana border would be down here somewhere. This is the Salmon River flowing north. And then at North Fork, it turns west and goes into the wilderness. And what I want you to see here is this south-facing slope. And notice, there's not a lot of trees on this south-facing slope. So, number one, not a lot of summer moisture. Very, very little. It's mostly all in the form of snow, snowpack. So as that snow melts, the south-facing slopes tend to melt quicker and run off faster. They don't infiltrate the soil as quick as
Water doesn't hang around.
Thank you. Yes, the water doesn't hang around. So without that penetration and without it getting into the soil and deep into the soil, trees aren't going to have a chance, right? But if you look, although there's some shadows here on the north-facing slope, the snow melt is slower, water's going to penetrate into the soil and be available longer so I can grow some trees, right? So that's the idea. So aspect, elevation, slope, and then of course, you know, what kind of moisture and when is it happening? Not just, and then also how much. And then of course we go to the extreme low elevation and we have bottomland, so another Georgia shot, and you can see bald cypress here. If you haven't seen bald cypress, one of the things that bald cypress can do, it does aerial roots. And so the aerial roots will allow for oxygen exchange because any plant, the roots need oxygen. Okay, some can tolerate being submerged for a while. And one of the things bald cypress does is produces an aerial root. I'm sorry that I'm not close enough that you can see that, but in here you may see some of them, and that allows for gas exchange. So the roots are submerged. And if we look in Maine, this is out in Wallagrass in the old Bushy woodlot that we used to work on, the students and I. And most of these trees are around 9-10 inches in diameter, and there wasn't one that wasn't at least 90 years old. And this site is usually very wet. This is one of the drier years. Cedar likes to be on wet sites, but also where you have water flowing, so there's oxygenation happening. But if this was this is a wet site, and on wet sites in Maine, we're going to see, especially if it's very wet, black spruce dominating and cedar dominating. And this is northern white cedar. You'll get some black ash in there in smaller clumps, but I haven't seen black ash where it's like completely huge stand dominating a site. It's usually smaller amounts of the tree.
Is that the same case for tamarack?
Tamarack will be in there as well, yes. Yeah, absolutely. And then fire, of course. A number of tree species have evolved with fire and so have adapted by having thicker bark. They can tolerate a ground fire, not a crown fire. If you have a crown fire, it can take out any tree. But the ground fire with thicker bark, those species like this longleaf pine, like ponderosa pine out west, even white pine in the east, and pitch pine, for example, will tolerate fire. And so what it does is the tree that has adapted to that, as the fire comes through and it takes out competition, so it can grow without that competition coming in.
Dave,
Yes?
how influential is the impact of temperature
Thank you. Good lead for me, because I should have said that. Thank you, Lester. So temperature. So when fire's coming through, species like jack pine and pitch pine may have waxen cones covered with wax, and that the heat of that fire may allow them to dry out, open up, and so then they're going to be spreading seed on that site after the fire's passed. So here you have seed coming into that ash. So hopefully that's your next forest, or at least you're going to have trees coming from that as a result. Fire frequency really matters. And in this site, this is another South Jersey site. It's a winter shot, so I don't know how well you can see this oak tree in here, but there's a bunch of oak that are growing up in the background as well. So fire hasn't been here for a while. And this is a very fire-prone area in South Jersey. And this oak tree, as you can see, it's getting up into the crown of the pitch pine. And there's some shortleaf pine in there. And if a fire had come through there in the growing season with the foliage, it would become a crown fire and really take out a lot of those bigger trees, biggish trees. So you can see this has grown over, and eventually, if there's no fire here, oak could take over that site. Oak will eventually shade out that pitch pine, which doesn't tolerate shade very well, right? And oak can tolerate the drier. These particular oaks can tolerate that drier, but then they're going to provide a lot of shade that the pine won't tolerate. So without the fire, we're going to eventually have an oak forest. Now, being from South Jersey, I can't pass this opportunity to talk about the pygmy pines. I don't know if you've ever heard of these. But the pygmy pines, they're about 12,000 acres in 4 different locations. These trees are about 8 feet tall. And they're fully mature, and they puzzled scientists for decades, wondering what the heck is going on and how can these trees reproduce and only be 8, maybe 10 feet tall, and a few of them. And I'm standing up on the road, and I can see over that forest. This is a huge site, hundreds and hundreds of acres. And so people have studied this, Rutgers University, over the decades, and they're thinking there's a number of things going on, the dryness of the site for one, but the fire frequency here is 16 years. The frequency every 16 years, on average, there's fire through here. Well, if you look at the average tree, let's say the average tree, 8 years, let's pick 8 years, it's able to produce a little bit of seed. I know it's not producing huge crop of seed, but it's producing some seed. If you have a 16-year fire frequency, it's quite possible that through evolution, you're going to be able to develop a maturity and producing seed faster than the rate of the fire, right? By a factor of 2 at least. So the thinking is that these trees have kind of just gotten used to that fire frequency, and they're able at least to drop some seed that's going to allow them to regenerate. And we're talking pine and oak mostly. Really interesting, like 12,000 acres of this in 4 different sites. It's really fascinating. And you get up on the road cut, and this is north and west of Atlantic City, and you look out and you can see, it looks like you're looking for miles. Do you have another picture of one? Oh, excellent. Yeah. Whereabouts?
This is, what is this road?
Probably 39, it's probably where that is.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, it's really interesting phenomenon. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. All right, so competition. So obviously, if we have a site dominated by an individual species, most likely it's going to be multiple in this species, right? But if it's dominated by a particular species, then that species has something over everybody else. Chance could be part of it, but is the respiration rate, is its utilization of sugar, of shade, is it a faster grower, slower grower? And what's its tolerance when it comes to shade, moisture utilization, nutrient utilization, and can it tolerate fire if fire is frequent? Now, I don't think of Maine as being, the fire being a really natural component here. The fire frequency in Maine, Laura, it's in the hundreds, isn't it?
I'm not sure, honestly.
I think it's well over 200-year fire frequency. It's pretty high. It's not like the coastal plain area. Okay, so real classic valley area. So you have an abandoned farm. And so in that abandoned farm, what do we usually see over time? We see birch and aspen coming in, a lot of time from seed. Some of you will remember out at Allagash when we had that 600-acre fire, over 20 years ago. There was a house, and I'm not sure if it was Troy Jackson's or somebody else's, and across the street where they had the fire, it just grew back into all birch because there was buried seed there, and the birch just came right up after the fire. But here we have abandoned fallow farm, and so birch and aspen come in from seed, but notice there's spruce and fir there. Probably came in at the same time or maybe a little later, and usually about 70 years out, that spruce and fir is going to start growing up and shading the intolerant birch and aspen. Okay? So eventually there's going to be a change, and you may have more, in time, more of a conifer forest than the pioneer. Pioneer meaning they're coming in at first like aspen and birch come in areas that are left fallow. And then I showed you this before. This is a northern hardwood. It's beech, American beech, yellow birch, okay? Yellow birch and sugar maple. And sugar maple and beech can tolerate a lot of shade, and you can see it's tolerating so much shade, it's producing a ton of seed, mostly maple. Yellow birch would prefer a little bit more light, so they'll come in and where there's holes, and it's producing enough seed, so when a tree falls down, hopefully the yellow birch can take advantage of that. And so it's a smaller component, but it's in there. Beech, birch, and sugar maple is example of what we would call a climax forest because it can regenerate itself. It can grow in its own shade. Okay? But a lot of what we have is mixed forest, right? So we have aspen, birch, red maple, sugar maple, spruce fir, even some pine. And so that's a lot of what we see in Maine. And trying to manage that, foresters are trying to pick out best what their markets are going to give them. And it depends on the goal of the landowner, right? It's what the landowner wants. Maybe it's a wildlife focus. So there'd be, the forester would be doing a prescription based on the landowner's goals and what the property, what that site is growing. And then, of course, when we're dealing with northern hardwood, and here you can see there's a large component not only of sugar maple, but also red maple and other species, aspen and birch as well. And go back to our discussion of fall color last class. So let's talk about some of our Maine forests, particularly spruce fir forest in Maine. This is down in Washington County. Back in 94, 95, I was able to go to Baskehegan land. It's owned by the Milliken Company. Pretty progressive forestry that they do. And here you can see a stand. So when we're dealing with spruce and fir, fir is an absolutely prolific reproducer. It produces so much seed that I've been in stands, and Laura can tell you better than I because she's got the management experience. You go into a stand and it's all spruce, and the regen is 99% fir. It's just maddening. So back in the 90s, it was either the late 80s or 90s, they did a study, and it might have been Maine. They had some squirrels, red squirrels, and they put fir seed and spruce seed. And guess what? They didn't touch the fir seed. They ate all the spruce seed. And then there's another thing that goes on. Balsam fir, as a seedling, puts a lot of energy into its roots. So if you have a fir and a spruce side by side, the fir is going to outgrow that seed as a seedling, no questions asked, if the site is exactly the same, right? So spruce is going to have a height advantage over fir in order to do any better. So it's got a lot going against it. So we have 3 native spruces. Okay, we have black spruce, wet sites. We have white spruce, dry sites. And black spruce also will occur in high elevations where it will dominate. And then we have red spruce, which wasn't planted because it's slower growing, but it does have the advantage that spruce budworm comes out a little bit before it breaks bud. So, and there's a lot of hybridization between black and red spruce. Sometimes you look at a tree and it's like, there's actually a key of 28 factors to separate the two. So they can be a little confusing. But if you're standing in water and there's a bunch of spruce trees, guaranteed it's probably black spruce. Okay? And I didn't say, but red spruce likes kind of a moist site, and it will be, you know, growing in a lot of different environments. But again, it's a slower growing than some of the others, but can do pretty well. So this is a map the University of Maine put together, and you can see how spruce fir forests really dominate our north and west. You can also see some of this purple of aspen and birch forest even down here, and then we get into the hardwoods more dominant as we go to the southern border. Okay, so in theory, if you have a lower respiration rate, you probably live longer, right? So that's the wise tale. So if you think about birch and aspen, faster growing trees, but don't live as long. If you think about sugar maple, probably has a lower respiration rate, slower growing, can tolerate shade, lives a lot longer. So it's kind of a general theory. And again, luck is involved there. Respiration rate, metabolic rate. There are different things, but we can kind of think of them together. So when we're looking at red spruce, we're looking at a tree that in the southern Appalachia, as you get down into Appalachia, I should say, can be 115 feet tall. Up here, we're seeing it 60, 65 feet isn't uncommon. But one thing that's interesting about red spruce is the range of red spruce defines what foresters and silviculturists call the Acadian forest. So the Acadian forest is actually outlined by red spruce's range. Can live to 400 years. There's not a single spruce, native spruce in Maine that doesn't live several hundred years. They all have the, excuse me, let me rephrase that. They all have the potential to live a couple hundred to several hundred years. And red spruce tends to be one of the more shade tolerant, but they all can tolerate some shade, no problem. And they all can grow in pretty good sunlight as well. Eastern white pine, our state tree, outside of the Northeast can get up to 150 feet tall, can live to 200 years. This, for those of you that ski and do the violet settlement, this is in the birch loop. So this tree is about 65 feet tall. I put my ski pole up to it. It's almost 2 feet in diameter. And if you've ever driven down Route 11 and wondered why did they leave those pine trees in the clear cut, it's because this tree can continue to grow at a good rate, twice as long as the spruce and fir. So they'll leave that in the clear cut to regenerate, or generate seed, because when they come back during the next harvest, it'll still have really good growth rate. The other problem is, well, it can tolerate shade, right? But the other problem is white pine and spruce, especially white pine and our introduced Norway spruce, are very vulnerable to a weevil that gets into the top of the tree. And I have counted 22 weevils, larvae, in a stem, in the leader. So the female will come in and lay eggs just below the ring of buds, and they'll go down and they'll eat their way down and they'll kill that leader. And so then you get the side branches coming up and you have these funky looking trees. Once you get above about 25 feet, then the weevil tends not to be a problem. And if it's shaded, the weevil tends not to be a problem. It's those sunlit stems that the females like to lay their eggs in. So by leaving those trees behind, letting them seed in the shade of whatever else they might be planting or growing, they have a chance of being weevil-free, hopefully. And like I said, these trees, record trees over 400 years old, they can grow 200 years no problem, and they continue to grow, a really good rate well into that second 100 year. I was having trouble with the image, so I threw that in there in case. I don't know, it was getting squirrely on me. Northern white cedar, notice this range. Oh, excuse me, let me go back. I didn't talk about the range, but this is a pretty broad range for eastern white pine going all the way out to the lake states and down into the Appalachians. It's pretty nice range, even up into Newfoundland, which I didn't realize. But cedar, notice it's a little more Canadian than American. And I should correct myself because John Martin would say we're all Americans, right? North Americans. So you can see we go way up into Ontario and Quebec, out into the lake states. Really interesting tree, can live a long time, loves to have a lot of moisture, but is a short stature tree, kind of my kind of tree. 40 to 50 feet tall, and beautiful. We use it a lot for forest products. All these trees that have been talking about, we're using obviously for forest products, but a really important tree ecologically as well. Sugar maple, we've talked about. Again, 200 to 300 year life cycle, can grow to 80 feet and taller. Outside of Maine, they may be even taller, especially as you go towards the lakes. Again, shade tolerant. Obviously, and I think I touched on this last time, if we're drawing sap out of that tree for maple syrup, we're going to have to thin around it in order for it, just not so we don't take the life out of it, right? But if we can create a very large crown that's going to produce a lot of sugar, then we can kind of steal off some of that sap to make syrup. Otherwise, really important in terms of wood products for furniture, everything from furniture to firewood, and a lot of browse for wildlife. So now we get into two of our faster growing species. We think of them as pioneer species. And notice this is boreal. This is going all the way up into Canada, way up towards the edge of where trees grow. 60 feet, 60 years, fast growing. One of the most amazing trees in terms of reproduction. Root suckers, stump sprouts, seed. You can break a branch off, stick it in the mud, it'll grow a root. They're pretty amazing and fairly attractive. And I thank Lester for the question about the petiole last time he asked about the flattened petiole. From what I can find out, they believe that it's an evolutionary advantage to shed wind, to keep from having crown damage and from blowover. So theory, right? But a good one. So I thank you for the question. That was a good question. But really an amazing tree that it can grow so prolifically. Now, I apologize for the quality of this. I'm hoping you can see those sprouts that have been cut back at least 3 times by me with a clearing saw. And so these trees are growing this way into my field from those trees over there. And all these are trees that came from root suckers themselves. And remember, with the root sucker, they're clones of whoever owns the root, right? So all of this is all root suckers. And because I kind of turn my vehicle around here, I usually will clear that by hand with a clearing saw. So this has been cut back many, many times, but still prolific. So as long as the soil gets warm, you're going to get root suckers. Paper birch, 60 feet. Here's a nice stand of them. Again, another boreal species that comes down into the Northeast. and all the way up into Alaska. Of course, as you get up towards the Arctic, they're going to be quite stunted, right? Willow and birch and will be quite stunted. But very, very prolific. I remember Mr. King, Garfield King, talking about birch bark, and he was fascinated by birch bark. Not only does it hold water if you make a vessel with it, but it's also great kindling. You know, it's really an interesting species. And of course, we plant it prolifically as an ornamental in our yards, usually as a cluster of trees. I have a little bit of a theory that one of the state biologists thinks I'm nuts and doesn't agree with me, but notice a lot of dieback on your birch trees. And open-grown birch trees are really vulnerable to a leaf miner. Actually, there's a couple leaf miners. And my theory is that those leaf miners really cause a lot of robbing of sugar, sugar production area, and a kind of a decline of health of some of the branches, and they seem to me to be the first ones to go out. Of course, I haven't backed that up with research, but that's my theory. But again, shade tolerant, fast grower. So these two, aspen and birch, very fast growing, but shorter lived, right? By significant amount. So let's talk about some of the big trees. And coast redwood is the proper term. And hopefully you can see this on the coastal areas from just touching into Oregon down to about San Francisco area on the coast. Where there's a lot of moisture. 200 foot, the record is 372. And I got to tell you this, I used to love to work with the fifth graders. And I went to Sinclair School when the when the school was there in fifth grade. And I'm saying, the biggest tree in the world is the coast redwood. And this little boy raises his hand, Mister, according to my Guinness book right here, it says the biggest tree in the world. This kid caught me. So tallest tree versus biggest tree. And it almost cracked me up, but I didn't want to laugh at him because he was right. He nailed it. But he had his Guinness book and he was checking my facts. So I love those fifth graders. But amazing longevity, 2,200 years, all right? And 12 feet in diameter. You can see my tiny little wife here next to this coast redwood. And then that brings us to giant sequoia, the biggest, not the tallest, the biggest. So they can get up to 250 feet. There's some record taller trees. This tends to be very fire-prone area. And there was concern back into the 70s that we were trying to control fire. And what was happening is all this grand fir and these other pine and fir species were coming in and causing the chance for ladders to take out the crowns of those other trees, which would destroy the whole forest. I did not put a range map on here because there are tiny little spots in the Sierras. These are in the Sierras, so it tends to be drier in the summer, okay? And the one thing, I didn't mention redwood. Of course, you all know we use it for furniture, especially it's tolerant, doesn't rot as easily. The thing that saved the few groves that we have of giant sequoia is the first few that they dropped just shattered. And so they gave this guy a permit. If you ever go to the big grove, you'll see a hollowed out giant sequoia that he had his little cabin in, and he had a permit to make shingles from the fallen trees. So if it wasn't for the fact that they shattered, who knows if we'd have them today, But again, a lot of scientists with the Forest Service have been pushing to either get rid of the competition and then reestablish fire as a natural component of these forests to save the trees. And so they were doing, Janine and I were there, 15 or 20 years ago, and they were already starting to do a little bit of thinning to take out the competition. And last time in class in the back, we saw the seed in the cone, and massive tree. So Janine and I are walking through the grove and I hear this rap, 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 rap. And I was like, wow, that must be a massive woodpecker. So I'm looking at this tree, and it was a dead giant sequoia all hollowed out, and this tiny little woodpecker flew out of there. But that tree just made him big. So 3,200 years of age, massive trees, 240 inches in diameter is possible. It's just amazing. In the last class, I showed you the General Sherman tree. This is just one in the grove. I want to talk about bristlecone pine, which are the oldest living trees. There's two different populations of bristlecone pine. So this that I'm talking about is the Great Basin bristlecone pines. So this is Nevada and outside of Las Vegas, north of Las Vegas, into a little bit of California and Utah. And these are high elevations, long winters, short growing season. They're scraggly trees. They don't get very tall, but some of them are 5,000 years old. And the Methuselah tree is dead now. It died. But these trees, what's interesting is some years ago we had somebody coming in for a job interview, and he gave a presentation on his research on dendrochronology using tree rings to date. And he said that there are 5,000-year-old dead, that there are trees out there that are dead, have been dead for 5,000 years and are still standing in these mountains. And so they've been able to go back 10,000, maybe even more years in terms of looking at climate change, which was really interesting. Now there's another population of bristlecone pine which actually can get fairly large, like more of a standard size tree. And it's because they're the Rocky Mountains, so it would be Colorado down into New Mexico with a little population in Arizona. But they have a 90-day growing window. So they can get a little bit larger and also very old. So anyway, those are our big trees, tall tree, big tree, and oldest trees. And I'm glad that Dr. Kyle's here because he's a chestnut man. And I cannot close out a talk about trees without talking about American chestnut, which was a long-running joke between my colleagues and I when we used to have the forestry forum. No, Dave, we don't want to talk on American chestnut. It doesn't grow up here. Jim O'Malley would always say that. But I have to tell you about American chestnut because I am sad that I never got to see its heyday. This tree, which is really interesting, it was tolerant of shade but fast growing and would dominate a forest. Now, it may not be a stand of chestnut. It might be the dominant tree in a stand and massive. So 100 feet tall, 13 feet in diameter, 270 years worth of age. There's some records that some of them may have been 800 years old. But what's interesting about chestnut is this. The nut crop kept wildlife and people alive. Huge crops. They say that squirrels migrated with the crop, which I still can't get my head around that. The bark was used in the tanning industry. And when the chestnut, 1904, a tree was brought in from Europe to Bronx Zoological Park. And within 40 years or so, wiped out the chestnut as a large tree. And it only exists today because of stump sprouts. And I showed you a slide which showed 3 generations of sprouts, the main stem and 2 generations of sprouts in the first class. So really that's the reason we still have the tree. Plus there are groves in Washington State and Michigan outside the range that are large trees that you can actually buy flour and nuts from that place in Washington. But the other thing was the wood, you didn't need preservatives. And there are still barns standing in Appalachia built from chestnut. At least there were back in 1980s when I was in school down in West Virginia. But what's really interesting is there's at least 4, if not 5 insects that are thought extinct that used to live on chestnut, the mature trees. So it's pretty sad. So when the trees kind of died out, the tanning industry was devastated people in Appalachia that relied on the nuts for food were devastated. So it was quite an ecological and economic disaster when we lost that tree. So anyway, this was the range. Don Raymond asked me how far up into Maine, and it's around Rockland. I've actually seen a 10-inch chestnut. Bill Livingston, Dr. Livingston down at UMaine, showed us some trees right outside of Rockland, about 10 inches in diameter, a good-sized tree and healthy. The largest of these trees were down in Appalachia. Anything else, comments or questions? Well, hey, thank you very much for coming out. I really appreciate it, and thank you for the questions.
Thank you.